Hello and greetings. Live from Washington, D.C. and around the world, we're here to talk about making space available to everyone. This is our first space salon with the Atlantic Council GeoTech Center, and we're honored to be here with folks from AWS, as well as from other sectors and industries, to think about how we can actually address the challenges about dealing with orbital safety, but also think about the opportunities available for the public to work together in space. With that, I'd like to first turn to Shayn Hawthorne. Shayn, could you talk to us a little bit about both the opportunities and the things that need to be addressed to deal with orbital safety?
Sure, David. Thank you for introducing me, and thank you everybody on the virtual world for tuning in to our salon. It's exciting in this day and age of COVID that we actually are able to get together this effortlessly. And so, as David had said, my name is Shayn Hawthorne, and I work at Amazon Web Services in a new business unit that we just stood up called the Aerospace and Satellite Solutions business. And we're pretty much focused on offering services like our popular ground station and other services to help everybody out. And what I'm most excited about from an opportunity point of view is, first, let me tell you all about a little bit of my past. About 23 years ago, was a young Air Force officer who was in charge of orbital deconfliction in Cheyenne Mountain for keeping the space shuttle safe. And in those days, it was called the Mir space station from Russia. And every day we tracked everything. We built special ephemeris vectors for these different objects to keep them safe. And we used a very manual messaging approach to let people know there was a problem and alert the world. And then that typically kicked off a bazillion other manual activities, again, to go keep these people safe in space. The opportunity that we're seeing now is that by combining and building services that offer all of this data as a service and even offer removal of debris as a service, you're getting a really strong public and private partnership. And it allows us to really do great things for the people in space and pave a way in the future for all the commercial use of space that's coming, such as the crewed vehicles, such as going to the moon, manufacturing, and a number of other activities that are coming. So what are some of the things that are going to help us do that, David? I would say mainly focusing on introducing platforms where it's very easy to build these services and make it easy for the government and for the commercial world to share data, both so that they can observe space and keep track of things that are up there, and so that they can alert people and share the required data to keep things safe, make maneuvers, and effectively re-enter objects. So we're really excited about what this community can do. We're excited to see where this public-private partnership keeps going, and want to keep providing the types of tools that help people do these great projects into the future.
Excellent, and thank you, Shayn. And if I could ask you a real quick rejoinder, because you mentioned how you were doing this more than 20 years ago as an Air Force officer, I'd be interested, from your perspective, what's been the biggest improvement in terms of the actual user experience or user interface of dealing with these big complex issues? Could you talk a little bit about that real quick?
Sure. Well, if you'd like to look it up later, everybody, on the internet, do a Google search on something called 427M, or 427M as in Mike. And that was the console that I used to use. It was this big, huge metal system where every software application that you implemented was just a button push. And you literally had no freedom at all in what the system did. You would just hit buttons and enter data and then tell it to go do a batch file. It could literally take us 4 or 5 hours to do an analysis of what objects could hit the space station. Today, you can actually log into the internet. Some of our panelists are going to talk about tools that do that. And you can actually bring up a web service on your home computer, and you can do the same analysis I used to do in probably 1 or 2 seconds and get that data up on your computer. And you could also go order a satellite to get launched on the internet as well to help you re-enter objects, or to start building things like some of our universities are doing. So it's really streamlined things and made it so that the user doesn't have to be an expert in astrodynamics, and the user is able to access this information quickly, and they only pay for what they need. So it's pretty big and dramatic change in how the environment's worked compared to the past.
Impressive, very impressive. So with that, I'd like to now turn to Dr. Joseph Bonneville, who's a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council, amongst other things. Joe, could you talk us a little bit about both your background and what do you see as the biggest opportunity, but also the biggest challenge in making space available for all?
Well, thank you, David, and thank everyone for taking the time to join us on this panel. I would say, given a little bit about my background, actually, I always do this and I always forget to do it. I have to give my caveat. The views and opinions that I express here are not the views and opinions of the federal government or the Department of Defense. So everything that I'm saying now is of my own volition. So moving forward, my background is in material science and mechanical engineering. So one of the things I like to do is failure analysis, right? And so as I look at what space means to us, it's funny this whole panel came about. I was watching Westworld very recently, and I looked at how they had the Internet of Things and how everything was interconnected because of all of the big data that was just being streaming through constantly. That is kind of the future I see now. If you've seen the show, I won't ruin it for you, but it can go very bad very quickly, but it provides an opportunity for us to really understand how we as humans interact with nature and how we interact with everything that we've got going on. And so how do you get that Internet of Things up and running? You get it through low orbit satellites and things of that nature. So we've got to have a lot of those satellites up in order to harness all of that data. The biggest problem to that is, in my opinion right now, is that we are unable to really detect and really quantify anything under 10 centimeters that's space debris, right? And so these things are basically the size of a coaster. These things are floating around, 20,000 plus objects just floating around in space up to 18,000 miles an hour. They can tear anything down that we've got there. And so we really need an effective and efficient way to do that. And I have a couple of things I'll talk about later that I think are ways for us to do that. But coming from a materials science background and kind of a failure analysis guy, we really want to understand kind of the impact parameters and how we can avoid those in collision damage from where and I'll pass the mic to someone else now.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. And Curtis, and you get kudos for the first sci-fi reference. We're now going to set the gauntlet for each of the different panelists to actually do their own sci-fi reference when they can sneak it in. With that, Jody, not to put you on the spot, Jody, could you give us a little bit about your impressive background? And then also, what do you think is both the greatest opportunity and challenge when it comes to making space available to all?
Sure. Thanks a lot, David. Glad to be here. So speaking of sci-fi, I happen to write comic books to help people to imagine the future at 10, 15 years out, and then help them figure out the plans to get there. But that's another hat that I put on. And one of the things, so my background, I am a product designer, and I specialize in human-machine interface issues. And so my work has spanned the gauntlet from DARPA's Big Dog to Microsoft's HoloLens and Toyota's AI car, which is this robotic AI vehicle. So a little bit of everything here and there. And so right now I'm engaged on a project with a Global Power for their Future of Space program. So lots of interesting things happening in this area. And for us, what we're really excited about is, as Joseph mentioned, these low orbit satellites that allow us to create really powerful applications on the edge. So thinking about how those types of edge applications actually can impact people outside of existing industrial or huge corporations. So for example, farmers in sub-Saharan Africa having access to satellite imagery to deal with crops, or allowing scientists here on planet Earth to control cobots that are on the International Space Station to conduct space experiments. So what we talk about and what we're really interested in is how greater access through reducing the specialized knowledge required both for commercial space travel, but also for these types of elements, such as the satellites that Shayn mentioned that can be launched online for a specific offering, or say greater training through things like virtual reality that reduce training times by 80% to allow for people to have really specialized knowledge that they've gained here on planet Earth. Say they're a mechanic or they're a mining engineer or something, allowing them to travel to space on these moon colonies and things with a rapidly, speeded up training mechanism so that they could really do the job that they're there for, but without requiring them to be also astronauts and experts in all things space. So that's what we're really interested in.
Fascinating. And I think what you're hitting on, Jody, is the idea that we're in an era in which we've already seen for cloud, it's all about microservices and actually being sort of play to your strengths and then partner with those that have other strengths. And it seems like space is going in the same direction, where we're actually able to sort of figure out what do you want to play as your strengths, and then who can you partner with to help make that happen.
Yeah, and how can we reduce the specialized knowledge in order to be able to do that?
That's very key, and then I think that really is keeping with the theme of making space available to all. Now, you didn't exactly reach in your sci-fi reference. You mentioned comic books, so we'll have to come back and see what you referenced in later. But now we'll turn to Michael and see if he can rise to the challenge. Michael, could you first give us a little bit about your background, and then two, what do you see as challenges and opportunities either for space as a whole or for orbital safety as an issue that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, great. And thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel and talk about this topic. It's definitely one that's near and dear to my heart. So I'm really happy to be here. So I'm one of the founders and the chief technical officer of a company called LeoLabs, and the LEO stands for low Earth orbit. And what we're doing at LeoLabs is tracking objects in the near space environment up to about a couple thousand kilometers from Earth. That's where most of the satellites are going, and that's where most of the space debris is. So we think it's really key to track those objects and maintain space safety in that region. And the opportunity is right in front of us. The era of space commercialization is really just beginning. Only a few percent of the first mega constellation has been launched, and we're going to see 50,000 plus satellites from around the world, international commercial satellites go into low Earth orbit over the next 10 years or so. And so the situation in 10 years is going to be very different than it is today. And already today is very different than it was 10 years ago. So we have tremendous work to do to support the infrastructure and services that will operate in LEO. So at LeoLabs, what we're doing is we deploy advanced phased array radars like the one behind me, which is in New Zealand, and we use these to track objects that are orbiting the Earth. We're trying to track objects down to a couple centimeters in size, pretty much any object that can cause the destruction of a satellite or threaten the space operations. We take all that data, we stream it to the cloud, and then we layer on data services and analytics on that to promote space safety. So for us, it's all about data transparency and illuminating the risks and the behavior that's going on in space. And we think that's the way to promote an environment where there's orbital safety and a future that isn't where space isn't full of debris. So a big aspect there is that we're a commercial data source with international systems, and we're working with international partners, commercial partners, to do all this. So it's a new approach to what's largely been a national and defense function, as Shayn was describing. And we're building out safety of flight services that go beyond just collision avoidance and really provide like a dynamical map of what's going on in space. So like weather maps, we take data from today and we forecast and predict what the environment is for tomorrow, but then we adjust to new information and the risks that occur, when an event happens or when a satellite maneuvers or whatever's going on. We need to be dynamically adjusting what's going on. And then we do this through a platform model, as Shayn was talking about, where we basically have an open API and encourage the development and engagement of our data on our platform with a broad range of users. So that's kind of what we're doing. I think our biggest opportunity is, we're establishing this new frontier in space and growing space applications to enable a wave of space services. And our biggest barrier is a lack of transparency, a lack of data, a lack of openness in space operations, and as a result, dealing with the ensuing chaos and unexpected and unintended actions. So, I guess a sci-fi reference. I think of the future described in WALL-E, and let's not make the orbital environment like that. Let's start talking about these issues now and taking actions now to promote the space future that we all want to see.
Excellent. And thank you, Michael. And I definitely like that you identified some of the challenges with transparency and the lack of data. And so we'll circle back to that with all the panelists. One question for you real quick. You talked about your forecast and everything that was coming in. Is this a case where people actually subscribe as a service to your forecast in terms of what you're seeing? Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, exactly. So, it's really kind of a new kind of map, just like a road map. We're creating a map of where every object is right now, and then we predict where it is tomorrow. And you can subscribe to that on a, SaaS-like basis and get access to those forecasts, and then, fuse them into your space operations models. Or if you're a space agency, you can fuse them into your, compliance or risk forecasting. So, we think that a lot of the space applications needs, derive from what space is going to look like in an hour or in a day or in a week or in a month, and so those require good forecasts.
Excellent. Thank you. Would now like to turn to Paul, who's been with us before on a great conversation about space. And Paul, could you real quick reintroduce yourself to our audience, and then also what do you see as both the challenges and opportunities, whether it's with orbital safety or of making space available to all?
Thank you, David, and I'm happy to be here again on the call with you. It's great to be with this panel as well. There's obviously some great experts on space opportunity here. I'm Paul Jurison. I'm the director of the Cal Poly Digital Transformation Hub, and that's Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, California. We're a polytechnic university. We focus on engineering, agriculture, architecture, areas like that. And the Digital Transformation Hub is a partnership between Cal Poly and Amazon Web Services. And what we do is we look at problems in the public sector and provide solutions to those problems. So we have a group of students that we work with, and our goal really is to be able to provide our students with real-world learning opportunities, the ability to use the latest innovation techniques. We use design thinking methodologies similar to what Amazon uses to develop their products. And we also bring in the latest technologies to help solve problems, whether it's in government, education, nonprofits. And the organizations we work with range from very small local organizations who might be looking at a challenge to solve the opioid crisis, or we might be working with very large worldwide organizations who might be looking at solving problems with gender equity in Kenya, for example. So we really have a wide range of things we work on. One of the things that we work on is space-related challenges as well, and how to find ways to give more people access to space. So let me give you a little bit of a background on myself. So I've been working in digital transformation and innovation for a really long time. I hate to say 30 plus years, but it's been 30 plus years. You know how you can tell? So I always know that I've worked for a long time when I go back to look at the organizations I've worked with, and they're not named the same anymore. So, so my first job out of college, I worked for the Defense Mapping Agency, which is now NGA. I also worked for Digital Globe, the satellite company, which is now Maxar. So I always have to remember double names when I go and talk about what I've worked with. So I've worked with everywhere from big government organizations to when I worked for Digital Globe, it was a startup, right? I was, I think, employee number 25 or something like that. So it was a small organization at the time. We were developing and building satellites for Earth imagery. I worked for the Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Geological Survey, where we used satellite data for many things. And then I came to Cal Poly about 8 years ago as the Director of Enterprise Systems, which is all of our IT infrastructure on campus, and then moved into this role with the innovation side of things. So it's been quite a journey, and we've seen a lot of things happen. One of the big opportunities I see, however, in having more access to space is that we want to get students this ability to think about what can be done in space, right? So we're looking at things like how can we use sensors in space to measure atmosphere? How can we look at geospatial data to respond to emergencies? How can we use the data that's collected in space, or how can we launch more spacecraft to be able to collect this data? And we want the students to be involved in that early in their careers, right? Early in their student student careers, so that when they go out into industry and work for organizations that can use this information, they already have hands-on experience. They know what technologies they can use, and they can really step in to make innovation work better. So one of the things I see, though, as a challenge to all of this is that there are barriers to entry, right? And they've been this way for a long time. It's getting better. There's more access to space now than there's been in a long time. But there's governmental regulations that slow things down. There's standards that have not been developed yet to launch more satellites and spacecraft. We're working with Vandenberg Air Force Base, for example, to take a look at how they can launch more satellites in a shorter period of time, because there's a lot of requirement to get those satellites up into space, but the number of satellites that can be launched in a certain period of time isn't that great because of many of these challenges that are out there today. So there's a lot of things that we can do to look at these things. I think Jody mentioned that we really want folks to be able to focus more on their subject matter, their mission, and not have to know everything about everything to launch a satellite, right? You have to know about cybersecurity. You don't have to know about how to get to maneuver around orbital debris. You have to know how to do all of this stuff before you can even launch a satellite. Now, I think there are services today that are being built. AWS ground station's one. We mentioned the satellite debris services that are another. All of these are coming together to make this opportunity much better, I think.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. That really sets the scene well. And then Simon, want to turn to you both to introduce yourself. And also, Paul was talking about sort of like these barriers to entry. So maybe if you could either talk about the barriers to entries or what you see as the greatest things that need to be both opportunities and things that need to be accelerated.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me on this panel. My name is Simon Reid. I work for Deorbit. The Deorbit is a company based out of Italy, near Lake Como. We've also got offices in the UK, Portugal, and the US, and I look after the UK business. We build our own satellites and operate them, and to deliver services in space for space transportation. And we were really committed to making sure that space is used in a sustainable way. So there's really three things there. So the company was actually started, and the name comes from the first product, which was a deorbiting device, which is something that you attach to a satellite with its own motor and control systems to make sure that a satellite can be removed from orbit, even in case of failure. And it works like a remote control kind of thing. What we're doing really actively now, we're in the business of delivering small satellites into space. So we take our spacecraft that works like a space taxi. So when you go on a launcher, it's a bit like mass transit. Everyone has to go together, and then you're in one place. And as space is being used more and more commercially, our customers need to get their satellites to a particular location in space, and so that's what we do, is we deliver them to space. And then the other thing which we're really working on is in-orbit servicing capabilities, which would include acting like a tow truck in case an existing satellite has stopped working, so we can dock to it and then remove it from where it is at the moment. So we do that work, and from the ground we manage that software from the ground, and we build our own software to handle all of that stuff, and we use Amazon a lot to be able to support that infrastructure. And we're actually using Amazon Web Service ground station network, which is currently being developed to do the communication between ground and space. So my own background is in space, but really the data side and data systems, both for modeling sort of satellite operations and automation and so on. But also most spacecraft are in space for generating or moving data. So it's that handling of the data that's coming down from space, which is a really big part of what we do as well. So in terms of opportunities and barriers, I think the real opportunity at the moment we have is a chance to make sure we don't lose our use of space because of all the debris which exists at the moment. there is a real risk that if we don't clean things up, things can get much worse, and then we'd actually not be able to use that resource. So now's the time. Now, in principle, it's actually easy to take a spacecraft or out of orbit. You just need to lower it so it can be burnt up in the atmosphere. So, what could be easier? But unfortunately, that hasn't quite worked out too well. And really, sort of the barriers to that and why this has happened is, I think it's to do with kind of invisibility, really. So there's an invisibility problem with a lot of people. Everybody's becoming more dependent on space-based services in their daily lives. But we don't really know that. Maybe we can publicize that a bit better. But also, we don't know the risks that are out there about the space debris and what impact that might have on these things. And then finally, even those of us who know that there is a problem, we still don't really know how bad the problem is. So there's a problem of invisibility of the data and knowledge of the debris and the things that are there.
Very well said. And I think you sort of framed it almost like how the early days when we knew that ozone layer deterioration, we started to think that it was happening, but we didn't exactly know why. We later got more data and we actually addressed the problem. We actually helped solve the problem. So I think you set the scene well, Simon, by saying if we can get enough data, we can get more visibility and more public awareness that space needs to be sustainable. And then we also need to figure out what can be done. Like you said, is it the equivalent of tow trucks to help deorbit, or other things that need to be done to make it sustainable? So Shayn, you've heard a lot from all these different panelists. I guess I would turn to you and say, given that we're now going to shift more to sort of lightning round questions in terms of looking for shorter answers from folks, what do you want to tackle first in terms of they presented opportunities, but also challenges? What would you think should be the things that we tackle in terms of questions to consider about accelerating these opportunities, but also mitigating some of the challenges?
For a quick answer, what I think would be good to look at would be from the point of view of building satellites like Paul's doing, building satellites like Simon and Deorbit are doing, and then also letting satellites out of their carrier vehicle, and then working with Mike in a tracking system that reports to the world. Would there be merit to continuing down this road of sharing and figure out how could we have maybe a standardized way of collecting observations or data that we could then freely supply to a company like LeoLabs so that they could add more information in possibly with the already robust amount of data that they're getting from their antenna systems. In other words, any parabolic dish in the world, any light telescope, et cetera, could become a space surveillance sensor that could feed data in. And there's going to be a lot of issues with this that I'm sure Mike can bring up. But I think that coming up with almost a crowdsourced way of collecting data in a way that you don't have to be an expert might be really powerful.
Excellent. And it sort of goes to the conversation we were having a little bit earlier about the Internet of Things. What's the interoperability standard for the Internet of Observing space things? So maybe, Michael, I'll go to you first for maybe a quick rejoinder on that. And then we'll do Simon, Paul, but if any of the other panelists want to chime in as well, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great thought that we need more data about what's going on, and we need more looks at kind of the overall space environment and where objects are. I think a basic thing that we can do to start that is simply having satellite operators share their ephemeris in a common way. And it's kind of astonishing that this isn't even done right now. I mean, it's done at kind of a small scale, but there's no kind of international and commercial government understanding or platform that does this. And this is one of the things that we want to do is team with satellite operators as they're putting their spacecraft up, get that data into our system, because nobody knows better about where their satellite, where it is now and what it's going to do than a satellite operator. And this also speaks to some of the things that Paul was talking about. Right after launch, it's one of the biggest challenges operators have right after launch is deployments of many satellites, especially small satellites, and getting information about their satellites right after launch, and then identifying which satellite is theirs. And that's really an issue we need to solve, both to make sure that those missions are successful, but also to establish a chain of custody, that this asset belongs to this satellite operator, and it's being operated responsibly and safely. I think these issues about transparency, data sharing, platforms to do that, are right on topic.
Excellent. Simon, if you could do a real quick rejoinder as well. What did you think about it?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, one of the big challenges of transparency is actually a lot of the custodians of the existing data is the military, and they are selective in what they share. And that is a problem. I think that is something that we need to sort of work on as well. But from the perspective of a satellite operator, fully in line with what Michael had just said there, in terms of we're the ones that will benefit most from such data, and there's a lot of data that could be more shared more routinely. And of course, we're in perhaps a special case in a number of ways. One is because we're actually in the process of creating objects in space as part of our service mission. So that first few hours, when that happens, that's a really critical moment for actually helping with the cause to identify those objects properly, but also to help figure out what their initial trajectory is. But also we're in a situation which perhaps could be mirrored by other operators, is that we're in space, and that is an opportunity to collect data about our environment while we're there and share that as well. So we can't, as well as detect the ground-based radars that LeoLabs is operating, spacecraft in space have an opportunity for collecting data and sharing that as well. And there's no real system for that at the moment, even though some operators do collect their own data, but there's no system to do it.
Very impressive, and I have the vision of, just like how we've talked about the future in which cars have collision and avoidance systems of their own, you can imagine the satellites themselves are being aware of their environment and not wholly dependent on the ground to actually identify possible collisions. Paul, real quick, maybe a slightly different lens on this. With your students, what are possible ideas that the students are thinking about or pursuing when it comes to trying to address this issue of linking things together to create a internet that links together everything that's observed and is going on in space?
Yeah, so it's interesting as we try to look at that linkage as you're mentioning, right? So everything eventually is linked in one way or another, right? So when we do our design thinking methodology and we really focus on human-centered design, what our students are doing is really working with the subject matter experts in lots of different areas, whether it's smart cities or space launch or satellite building, and really looking at what's needed to be able to do what we need to do to be successful in many of the areas we're working on. One of the areas that we're really focused on, and this is something I think we need to not forget about, because I think when we're launching lots of different satellites into space and communicating with them in various ways, is the cybersecurity around that, right? So we have lots of services we depend on from space, whether it's communication satellites, geospatial data, all of that. In many cases, the security of the communications is kind of a secondary thought. So we're spending a lot of time these days looking at what are the needs to keep those communications safe. Our students, in fact, just developed a prototype, a very low-cost prototype that can be used on CubeSats to be able to encrypt data between the satellite and the ground station. So what we're trying to do is look at low-cost ways to be able to keep data safe and still launch lots of satellites to do the kinds of things we need to do.
Excellent. Thank you. And Shayn, I want to circle back to you again, because you've seen this both when it was done exclusively by the US government and other governments, and now it's involving industry. What are other key questions that we should be considering?
Well, one thing that would be very interesting I've thought of, and it'd be great to get all of our panelists' inputs, from the DoD point of view, the HMI point of view, as well as the space operators point of view, is it in the age of the cloud, and internet-like connectivity of satellites and space objects, we really could get to the point that these satellite constellations operate as a software-defined network instead of today. Most satellites kind of operate like in the old, like the Westworld discussion. You know, when you had phones in those days, you'd stick a cord into one hole and into the other hole, and you connect these things that want to talk. And satellites talk the same way usually. But a lot of people are moving towards more of a software-defined network approach. If you do that, you can actually start to integrate the satellite with the sensors that are collecting the data that tells you where everything is, with a collision avoidance algorithm that's finding potential collisions and then warning you. And you can actually make a feedback loop that could help your systems operate in an automated way to avoid problems. Change their orbit a little bit, because in space, 1 or 2 seconds of change in your orbit can literally be hundreds of kilometers away and give you safety. So I'd love to get the panelists' thoughts there as to their thoughts of whether the systems are ready for that level of automation. And that way you could remove this from being a human activity and make it, like you had alluded to earlier, an automated vehicle, an automated collision avoidance system that you could use in space.
So I'm going to go to Joe, then Jody, then Michael, if that works. Joe, I know you have something to add from the DoD perspective.
So yes, the answer is yes. That's something that I think is absolutely being developed. Kind of speaking to the neural network, if you will, of satellites, where you've got this what I'm going to call a beehive mentality, where there's an active component of understanding where you are, but also getting the relay of information from the ground or whatever other sources that you may have. That is something that has its inherent challenges as we try to do that even with drones nowadays, right? So while you're trying to have this hive mentality where you're putting a bunch of drones up, and you want to understand what each individual drone is doing in conjunction with the mass of drones that are around. I can say that it is a challenge from a cybersecurity standpoint, as well as a challenge from just the general connectivity between the satellites that we're seeing right now, right? So as you begin to put more and more satellites up, you begin to get interference. And then, you know, I kind of alluded to this in our panel earlier. We don't have the same data sharing, nor do we have the same policy standards for talking across satellites that we should, right? So there's not this crosstalk that says, you know, I'll keep it simple, right? So 1 foot versus 1 meter, right? So how close are you to me, and what units are we using, right? And so as we begin to see that these things aren't aligned, we've got to, I think, at a 30,000 foot view, figure out how we're going to all talk the same language and have the same interoperability as we move between the layers. And once you kind of get that baseline and that data infrastructure there, then you can say, all right, now I know, you know, your satellite's, you know, here, my satellite's here. We may intersect. So I'm going to move, you know, 2 meters up, and you move 2 meters down, and we've got a perfect intersection there. I will say this: we are actively looking at that. But one of the things that the DoD and NASA, actually, DoD and NASA is looking at is when we bring satellites back in, we look at the damage, right? So our current system is the sensors that come in from the damage that come back from what was the space shuttle, but also any other satellites that we bring in. And we try to determine what causes damage. That's not the most efficient or effective way to do that. And so now kind of trying to understand what's going on. So something like what LeoLabs is doing is something that could be really beneficial if we could share our data with them, and then, you know, we being the government, share our data with them, which is industry, which is always usually light years ahead of us anyway, and trying to understand kind of where we can go and what we're doing. Sorry for the
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. And Jody, I know you were smiling at a lot of those comments there, so would be interested in your perspective as well.
Yeah, Joe, I think what you're talking about is really a big challenge, not only because of the different metrics being used, but also maybe some of the different policies in place. So we talk about the U.S. government collaborating with LeoLabs and places like that, but then we also need to get the Chinese government and the British government and the Belgian, and, you know, like I don't know, Sierra Leone's government. Like, there's so many different governments that need to be involved in that. And so, if we look at the equivalent here on the ground, it's going to take us a good 10 to 15 years to get self-driving cars really deployed at a grand scale. And so, we think about space as being like this new frontier. There's nothing up there, but really there's tons of stuff already up there, and trying to figure out how we retrofit those existing services with these new services that you're discussing can really pose a challenge. I think when we get to that, one of the things that I keep hearing in the panel over and over again is the way that the data is encoded and who has access to the data up there. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we face in moving towards an open and accessible space for all, is thinking about changing that regulation on who can have access to the data coming down from the satellites. So like I'm talking about, if we want to empower this small family farm in sub-Saharan Africa to be able to use it as easily as, say, the US government, we need to be able to think about not just safety protocols in terms of military secrets or something like that, but also in terms of everyday users, and how we can make that usable but not congested and overwhelm the system and cause bigger problems than we're even imagining now. And I'm thinking about that in terms of, well, we still have a small group of countries that drive on the right side of the road, and another group, or smaller group that drive on the left side of the road, and we wouldn't be able to put those two cultures together. So how are we going to attack this from a bigger...
Not to mention metric versus imperial system.
Yeah, let's not get into that.
No. I've heard some things crashed on Mars because of that. Who knows? All right, Michael, I'd be interested in your thought, and then I actually have a question for all the panelists too as we get closer to close.
Yeah, so I think the idea of connectivity between swarms of satellites is a really enviable goal, and the idea of kind of the systems operating in space are operating autonomously to both fly their mission, but operate safely and sustainably and within the bounds of their regulations or their licenses or whatever. But this is a really challenging area, and it's not the same. The challenges are not the same as like a self-driving car or unmanned aerial vehicles. It's a different set of challenges. There's a couple of big reasons for that. One of them is that in space, there's a lot of different stakeholders in space, as we've just there's commercial, there's international, there's military, and you have all of these players in space who have different levels of openness and transparency and different objectives in space. And getting them to talk and to talk externally and to the public is a difficult ask. And then the other one is a more practical matter that that a lot of the risks are just not observable by a single satellite, like say they are from a drone or from a self-driving car or even from a constellation. So like a constellation of 1,000 satellites, doesn't necessarily or even at all have a sense of the risks around it. So you really need to engage with systems that are looking at space from afar and assessing the risks and getting that information into the network in space. And so, that really requires this connectivity in real time to this kind of these third-party dynamical systems. And, when we have this future where there's, a network in space where, there's like an AWS region that's low Earth orbit, that's exciting. And, I think that enables a lot of this. And, hopefully we can achieve something like that where satellites are able to operate autonomously and safely.
Excellent. And real quick, to pull on one thread that you said real quick, when you said observing it from afar, were you thinking solely from Earth, or are you also thinking that there may be some things that may even be geo or beyond geo that might be looking at, mid or lower Earth to actually inform what they're seeing as well?
Yeah, I think it's, getting different looks at the system is very valuable for understanding what's going on. So I do think there's, a place where, non-Earth observing systems can play in that. I think that there's a cost benefit trade-off there, more practical aspects to understand whether there's, whether it really makes sense, but definitely, different sensor modalities is a big area, looking at the system, whether it's from optical or radio waves or other approaches, all of that sheds new light on the situation and gives a better understanding of what's going on.
Excellent. So recognizing we've got about 14 minutes left. One thing that I'd like to sort of go through with the panelists, and I'll go to Shayn first, and we'll go through, would ask, one question we got that we received was from a Dr. Peter Brooks, who was asking about data, and maybe there's an opportunity to address this data through what's called a data trust. This is the idea that you actually bring together industry, you bring together the public, you bring together governments, and you recognize that different people have different equities in terms of either things they want to keep confidential or proprietary or protect. But maybe we need to actually do a data trust. And so my question would be, given we've talked about the data coordination challenges, who would you approach first? Would you approach the G20? Would you approach the UN? Would you approach the US government, the US legislature to try and pass a bill to make this happen? Or would you do none of the above and maybe it's industry partnerships? So real quick, short answer on that. Shayn, I'd be interested in your thoughts about where would you go with the data questions?
You know, I would go with the data questions to industry first, try to see if we could come up with an open source approach that everybody sort of buys into. And then we would have something we could bring to the government that is already started and that we have buy-in from a number of partners, as opposed to trying to legislate an answer. So I would start with industry.
Sounds great. And that's a great tweet length answer. I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order. So Simon, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yes, so I'm with Shayn there. I think there's a role for government, but I think there's a speed issue here. And I think industry is much better equipped to innovate and actually show the way, and it doesn't have to be proprietary in any way as well.
Excellent. Paul, maybe if you could do sort of a lens on what your students might be able to do with helping to tackle the data issue as a quick answer.
Yeah, so, and people have said this already, more open source data, we believe, at the Digital Transformation Hub, where we have our students working, we believe that open source publishing really creates a more opportunity for innovation. So what we do is every challenge we solve at the Digital Transformation Hub, we publish in open source. You can go to our website, you can get that data, go do whatever you want with it. And we think that's really important. And we think that public-private partnerships are really important as far as putting that together, right? So we work a lot with governments, but we also work with private organizations like AWS to take that information, get it out into the world, and have more innovation done around it.
Excellent. I'm now going to mix it up because we've got about 11 minutes. We've got another question that's come in. I'll go to Michael first. It's relating to the data issue, but the question is, what can the US government do to facilitate greater data exchange, both between partners and also recognizing across different space sectors and countries? So Michael, if you were president for the day, what would you prescribe the US government to do?
Well, that's a big ask. So, you know, I think that the best thing that the U.S. government can do is lead by example. So, you know, promote data transparency both for, you know, government assets when possible, but then encourage government or data sharing for U.S. companies. So, you know, establish kind of this expectation with commercial satellite operators and the commercial industry that, you know, that there's a lens on what's going on in space, and you know it's really the best way to tackle the unpredictability of the environment is to watch what's going on and understand what's going on. So you know basically you know promote concepts for data sharing between satellite operators, and then encourage the development of new technologies for facilitating you know new measurements of what's going on in space.
Excellent. And I will at least briefly say I have my own experiences in a different realm trying to deal with counterterrorism information sharing, but also with public health. Did about 5 years and actually was involved with bioterrorism. We had the phrase that data was a 4-letter word. We just didn't know it was spelled TURF. And so I think anything that can be done to remove that is actually key. Joe, recognizing you're giving your personal views, but what would you prescribe if you could be president or prime minister for the day?
So I think that what I've heard here, at least from other panelists, and I think we kind of all are saying this in a different way, we want to crowdsource the problem, right? We want the diversity of the innovations to come through crowdsourcing from wherever it may be on an open network. I think the government, as a president for the day, I would say that I would want to see us be able to crowdsource this problem across multiple across multiple sectors and across multiple governments. And I think one of the things that we may lose sight of is what is the end goal? And the end goal really is for us to either bring everybody online across the world, right? So if we're putting all of these LEOs into orbit, we're trying to bring everybody online. We're trying to give everyone a better life. So if you lead by what your goal is and what your prospect is for that particular country or that individual, as Jody said, someone in Africa wanting to use it for weather forecasting, whatever you want to do, if we can lead with our end goal, maybe we can find some common ground to really do this data sharing.
Excellent. And Jody, your thoughts if you were Madam President for the day? And then I'm going to see Simon has a rejoinder.
Yeah, I want to double down on what Joseph just said. I mean, the thing is that when we think about it as a government thing, then we are solving for government problems. And if we open it up and make it open source, then we're solving for more types of cases, edge cases, that we aren't even considering from a government standpoint. But I think there's even another step above that, which is that with open source, we're attracting people that are already attracted to solving these problems, such as our panelists here. And so we almost need to open it up even further to start to ideate about these really extreme edge cases that we're not even considering being part of this problem, and think about how those extreme use cases start to create huge breakthroughs for how we think about distributing the data and giving access to the data, and for what reasons and for what purposes. So I think, yes, open source, but even bigger, like how do we get kids thinking about this? How do we get people that have no idea that they even need the internet thinking about this, right? So thinking about it in this much bigger picture would actually create huge breakthrough opportunities that we aren't even imagining from a government perspective.
Excellent. And Simon, thank you, Jody. And Simon, you had a rejoinder?
Yeah, so we're talking here about sort of the data, the problem of the data handling, which is there to really look at the real problem we have, which is the actual debris, right? And the actual. So I think there's an important role there in government in making sure that we can make sure good practice is maintained and improved, so that actually that problem goes away, that first problem goes away. And I think there's an important role there in terms of demonstrating and act in the way that you expect everyone else to act, first of all, and also perhaps legislate to encourage good behaviour and penalise bad behaviour in whatever way. So I think that's a really important part of
very well said, and I want to.
Space, yeah.
And I think you hit the nail on the head, Simon. That we need to make sure the data leads to action, and like you said,
yes,
the action is trying to make space sustainable. One of our GeoTech commissioners, Sue Gordon, who spent several years in government and is now in the private sector, Sue Gordon actually made the observation, which I would agree with, that things that used to be done exclusively by government now need to be done either with industry or the public. And like you said, even that mission of making space sustainable, it may be a partnership where government is working with industry and the public to make it happen. But we may discover that our institutions we currently have are not the right institutions. And so we need to figure out how we transform those relationships to make it occur. Shayn, you have the final rejoinder with what might be 2 or 3 tweet links, recommendations that you would have that would flow from this in terms of what we can move forward as leaders.
Well, the 2 or 3 tweet length rejoinders I would throw out that I think are exciting is let's keep pushing towards providing data as a service with open APIs that anybody can use. And let's continue to foster collaboration so that we can work together to transform space.
Excellent. I think that is a great sort of cohesive, holistic synthesis of our conversation today. I want to give thanks to all our panelists. This has been a very lively panel in which we have presented ideas, both action-oriented ideas as well as data-oriented ideas to make this happen. Thank you all, and truly look forward to a future in which we make space available to everyone.